During my annual physical, my doctor asked me if I was seeing my dentist regularly. Then he asked me if I wear a seatbelt when I'm in the car. And finally, he asked me if I smoke. He explained that the three most likely things to kill a man in middle age is to be in a car accident without a seatbelt on, or to smoke cigarettes, or to allow gum disease to go undetected. That's the one that kind of threw me. I didn't know that there is evidently a relationship between gum disease and heart disease. My doctor was doing his due diligence, asking me about behaviors or habits that might pose a threat to my welfare. He did not mention being shot, which statistically is now much more likely than dying in a car accident, but you can't really expect a doctor in the Ozarks to bring up anything that might question gun ownership. As a progressive spiritual community in the midst of the fear, outrage, and frankly very dangerous talk of war in response to the ISIS-inspired terrorist attacks in Paris on Friday evening, it's important for us, since we talk about evidence-based faith as opposed to shaping your worldview and making your decisions based on superstition or magical thinking or pure emotion. Now is a time that we have to apply those skills to what's going on in the world around us. We have to bring that critical thinking, spiritual perspective of evidence-based faith into the midst of a time when the world appears to be ready to go absolutely crazy. This is who we are, this is what we do, and we have to talk about what is true. We have to talk about what is real and not just get sucked into the fear-based anger, hatred, and bloodlust of our lower nature. In spite of what might be implied by watching the news on a daily basis, your chances of being killed by a terrorist is not only not high on the list of likely causes of death, but again, based purely on math, you are many times more likely to be killed by a dairy cow. Now, you may say that you are highly unlikely to be in a field or a barn with a dairy cow, and yet, even though that is probably true, it's still more likely that you would be killed by a dairy cow than that you would be killed by a terrorist. Since 9/11, our nation has spent over $700 billion on Homeland Security. $700 billion. Homeland Security is now a huge industry with thousands of employees, multi-million-dollar contracts, and office buildings that rival the office space of the Pentagon and the National Defense Department. And they are devoted to finding terrorist threats and either stopping them or defending against them. We had a speaker at Drury University a few years ago that was there quasi-recruiting, but basically as a Homeland Security public relations speaker. And in the question and answer time, I asked him if the flu didn't actually represent a much greater threat to the American population than did foreign terrorists. And that rather than spending $700 billion on Homeland Security, that we could save tens of thousands more lives by encouraging everyone to get the flu shot and by washing their hands regularly. And the speaker was furious at the question, I suspect in large part because it is absolutely true that the flu represents a greater threat by thousands of times than do terrorists. But news agencies don't find the flu to be interesting enough to talk about. Terrorism is the warfare of the poor. When we go to war, we put people in uniform, we put them on board ships, we put them inside airplanes, we move our armies to a battlefield. But oppressed people who feel that they have a legitimate reason to go to war, but they do not have the equipment of warfare, turn to terrorism. This has almost always been true. You cannot defeat a country like Russia by blowing up a single passenger plane, but you can frighten the population of Russia and you can humiliate the government by blowing up a commercial passenger plane. They do not have the ability to attack a French military base, but they can attack a French newspaper office, or a concert, or a market where unsuspecting civilians are vulnerable. They certainly couldn't take on an American naval vessel or take to the air to challenge one of our fighter jets, but they can infiltrate commercial airways, leave a bomb on a city street during the Boston Marathon, and attack the public. Again, that does not amount to defeating the United States in a war, but if you pay close attention to our 24-hour news cycle, it looks like it comes pretty close to it. The point of terrorism is to terrorize. The point of terrorism is to make people scared. It only works if the general population agrees to be scared. Terrorists try to make their numbers, the size of their constituency, seem many times larger than it actually is through violent scare tactics. And our media plays into the deception. You would think that ISIS is absolutely everywhere, but ISIS has about 30,000 soldiers, largely recruited from the ranks of the dismissed soldiers of Iraq. But their surrounding Arab nations have a standing army of over 4 million. So 30,000, 4 million. So it's not like their military presence is anything like the size that deserves the amount of attention that they get. Some of our presidential candidates were immediately reacting on Friday night, talking about refusing to accept any Syrian refugees into our country or deporting the few that are already here, as if we should now suspect every Muslim on the planet of being a terrorist or terrorist supporter or sympathizer. There are over 6 million Muslims in France. If even 10% of them were extremists wanting to commit acts of terrorism, that would be 600,000 terrorists in France. If it was 1%, that would still be 60,000 terrorists. People, if 1/10 of 1% of the Arab Muslims in France were terrorists, that would be 6,000 terrorists in that small country alone. The people who committed these horrible acts do not represent Islam, not even to the 0.001% of Islam. There were 8 known criminals. There were probably 10 or 15 accomplices, some of whom were living in Belgium, and some of whom admittedly had managed to get in with Syrian refugees. But they are not representatives of Islam. They are violent criminals, and they should be treated as such. We do not need to take a pound of flesh out of 100,000 Muslims for every one Muslim that turns out to be a crazy, violent criminal. ISIS announced that they would infiltrate the flow of refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan and take their fight to Europe. And in spite of Europe's best efforts at vetting the millions of refugees who have streamed into their countries, ISIS managed to make good on their pledge, and they brought a nightmare to Paris. Vetting refugees who arrive in large numbers with no papers. Obviously, they're fleeing a country, so they don't have a passport, they don't have identification papers, and if they don't, by fingerprint or some other means, have a known criminal record, it's pretty much impossible to find the ones that are infiltrating among refugees. So then, is the answer to turn away millions of refugees fleeing violence and starvation? There will be people in France who say yes. There are lots of people, including people who think that they should be president of this entire nation of immigrants who at one time came here either in chains or came here fleeing starvation and poverty in another country. There will be people who think they ought to be in charge of this nation of immigrants who tell you that we should lock up our borders and not accept any of these desperate people trying to flee from violence in their home country, to turn away tens of thousands to avoid letting a dozen terrorists slip through. Because some people are very, very concerned about being virtuous as long as it involves no personal risk or no personal sacrifice. But if you are going to do the right thing in any crisis, there is personal danger, and it can come to visit any one of us. It's not a small thing. Paris just lost 120 lives of mostly young people who were out having a good time on Friday night. More than 300 were shot and wounded. That's huge. It is serious. That's almost as many people as will be shot and killed in the United States this week. But is it enough then to motivate us to turn our backs on millions of people, among whom there are thousands who are innocent, who will die if they are not allowed to escape Syria and Afghanistan? The fact remains that the majority of what is called terrorism in our news industry does come from people who claim Islamic faith as their motivation. Modern Islam has challenges to face because it isn't just those who become terrorists, but it is also a problem with those who are sympathetic with the extremists. It's a real issue. It's not a small one. Shortly after 9/11, the most common name given to children in the Middle East was Osama. So there is a degree of sympathy with Muslim extremists that really does need to be addressed, and it's an issue about which Muslims need to be talking to each other. But across the globe, Muslim groups have been condemning this attack in Paris. We should never assume that just because it's not heavily reported that there is sympathy in general. Most Islamic groups that have spoken up since the Friday attacks in Paris have summarily condemned this and say, "Not in my name. You are not representing me." But honestly, we only call it terrorism if a Muslim does it. If you were listing terrorists from the perspective of a schoolgirl in Pakistan or from the perspective of a farmer in Afghanistan, they might be more likely to think that the people that operate the drone policy that has resulted in tens of thousands of deaths in their countries as terrorists. People in Syria might think that American, French, British, and Russian bombers that kill people in their neighborhoods and villages, they would say that they are terrorists. As was reported in the New York Times this week, Mr. Hollande actively stepped up French participation in the military air campaign in Syria at the end of September. Just last week, France attacked oil operations under the Islamic State's control in Syria. On October 8th, it conducted a targeted strike against militants in Raqqa, Syria, apparently targeting the Salim, a French citizen fighting for the Islamic State. So while there are people waking up in France saying, "We didn't do anything to provoke this, we are not at war with Syria," in Syria, they are aware that the French have been bombing their country heavily for months. We tend to see a terrorist attack like the one in Paris as a standalone crazy crime, but there are no coins that only have one side. And our media has been nearly apoplectic talking about the horror in Paris without even mentioning the fact that Beirut and Baghdad have been attacked just a day or two earlier. No one in the American press was screaming for an all-out war on ISIS when they brought down a Russian commercial plane. And I get it. I've got a friend in Paris. I called Brigitte to be sure that she was okay as soon as I heard about the shootings. We tend to identify as Western Europeans more than we do with Middle Eastern or Eastern Europeans because we're more likely to have family and friends there. We're more likely to have vacationed there. We have some sense of identity there. But really, come on, does it really matter if you are sleepless and frightened in Beirut or sleepless and frightened in Paris? We can all agree that terrorism is evil. We can agree that public beheadings, the deaths of innocent civilians in almost all of these events is horrible. But if we're honest, we must admit that we do not see these things taking place in a vacuum. There are reasons why ISIS can recruit people and why some people can even be driven to the point of becoming a suicide bomber. They do not hate us for our freedoms, though they are often offended by many of our cultural customs. What they hate us for is sending the CIA to overthrow the government in Iran and install Reza Pahlavi as their Shah. They are mad about our manipulation of their governments for access to their natural resources and to control their borders and their trade. For the most part, the Arab Muslim world loves the West. They want to engage in our economy. They like our technology. They like many of our products. They don't want to be occupied, and they don't want to have their culture extinguished by our movies and our music and our foods and our culture. But who does? How would we react to constant occupation or manipulation of our government, our economy, and even the products on our shelves by foreign governments? I am horrified by the civil war in Syria. I'm heartbroken for the millions of refugees. We hear of politicians screaming that we can't just sit back and watch, that we have to bomb them, we have to extinguish them, we have to do something to stop ISIS. And a part of me certainly agrees with that sentiment. But I would remind you of the Hippocratic oath that doctors are supposed to live by, to pledge that in the practice of medicine, they will do no harm. First order of business. If you can't help them, don't hurt them. Don't do something just to do something. We keep deposing tyrants to install someone we think will be better, only to find out that in almost every case we make things significantly worse. There's a bloody civil war going on in Syria, but if the West brings the United States, France, Britain, Italy, if we bring our Air Force and military to help the rebels, and Russia brings their Air Force and military to help the Assad government, then the only thing we can be certain of is that tens of thousands of innocent Syrians will die. If we can't help, we should be resolved to not hurt, as hard as it is for us to sit out a good war. If only we could topple bad governments and install good governments, it would be worth doing. But anyone with an awareness of modern history knows that our track record is horrible. Ever since 9/11, we have assumed the posture that every terrorist act calls for us to make a horrifying and disproportionate punch back, telling ourselves this will stop them. But it doesn't. It only makes it worse. And now we have lots of people demanding that we do it again when we know it has never worked. ISIS exists because we invaded Iraq. If we had not invaded Iraq, ISIS would not exist now. So we struck back against what we said were terrorists. Turns out, wrong country. I don't know how you wipe that away, but we invaded the wrong country and created ISIS. And now they're saying that we need to do it all over again. And it has to be said, that is exactly what ISIS wants us to do. They are not frightened by the prospect of a war with the West. In fact, a war with the West is what they want. That is their goal. They suffer from delusions that they could win such a war with Allah's help, without ever seeming to notice that Allah just doesn't get involved with that sort of thing. Rationally, does it really make sense for us to do what ISIS wants us to do? I would remind you of the tragic murder of 9 innocent people at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston this past summer. The shooter, a domestic terrorist, went into this historic church that has a long history that began in their organized opposition to slavery and continued in leadership roles throughout the civil rights movement. And this deranged white supremacist thought that if he went to that specific church, the most famous church in his state, as he described it, and murdered a lot of black people, that he could start a race war. And he assumed that his race would win that war because, after all, he and his constituency have been stockpiling weapons for that war for a century now. But there was no race war ignited in the June 17th murder because on June 18th, there were surviving church members that spoke up about forgiveness and reconciliation. They didn't punch back. And by the time a week had passed, that church was covered in flowers and filled with donations from white people all over the country, including us. I collected your donations and took the check to Charleston myself and delivered our sympathy, our support, our commitment to compassion to them in person. And one of the people that Dylan Roof had hoped would then hate people like you and me enough to want to kill us came out onto the sidewalk in front of Mother Emanuel Church in the 100-degree day in June in Charleston, South Carolina, and she hugged me and we wept together and pledged our love to each other. Because they have shown us a better way than hitting back. The United States government did not bomb Shelby, North Carolina, even though that's where they found Dylan Roof. They did not bomb Lexington, South Carolina, where he lived. That's the nest of racist sympathizers that produced him. They just arrested Dylan Roof and put him in a cage where dangerous animals deserve to be. But there was no hint of us needing to kill his relatives or his friends with drone strikes, or for that matter, to turn around and invade Canada, because a lot of people in Canada kind of look like Dylan Roof, the way we invaded Iraq because they lived in the same global neighborhood and were the same shade of brown as the people from Saudi Arabia who had attacked us. I do not know what the comprehensive answer to the threat of terrorism is, but I do know one thing. Doing things that create more terrorists is not the answer. We need to stop manipulating the internal affairs of foreign governments, and we need to stop trying to use the military to address every global crisis. As President James Madison said over 200 years ago, war is the parent of armies, and armies necessitate debt and taxes, and those are the known instruments of putting the many under the domination of the few. So no nation can maintain freedom while being in a perpetual state of war. The war on terrorism was a decision to be in a perpetual state of war. Even if we use deceptive language like the Patriot Act to say that we're going to take away your freedoms because of our patriotism, or because of your fear of terrorists, we are then going to draw you under the thumb of a federal government. Ladies and gentlemen, 32,000 people a year are killed by guns in the United States by Americans. In the entire history of our country, we have hardly lost 4,000 lives to terrorism at all. In my lifetime, over 1 million Americans have been killed by guns, and yet we don't even want to have that conversation in public. We can't even get the Congress and the Senate to discuss it. Terrorism does not represent a global threat unless you are willing to give them that power. Real global peace will be achieved through the raising of the standard of living of people everywhere. It is very rare, there are exceptions, but it is very rare to find a terrorist that had a good job and owned a home and had a family. When we raise the standard of living for people in every country, the kind of anger that seems to produce terrorism will start to go away, especially if we do the basics of providing clean water, housing, education, health care, and a chance to live free to people everywhere. We will not create the world we hope for at the tip of a spear. We've spent more than $2 trillion in the last decade and killed 500,000 people, proving that you don't create peace and democracy at the tip of a spear. Now we can try something else. Something smarter, something more kind, something more effective. For today, I simply beg you to stop being afraid. I'm going to end with a philosophical quote from Yoda. Forgive me. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. So I think we should try the other way.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.